He barely clipped a handlebar as he squeezed past a line of parked motorcycles. Nothing more than a light brush, the kind most people wouldn't even notice. But the biker didn't register it as an accident. What he saw instead was an elderly man in a washed-out jacket, and in his mind, that alone was reason enough to lash out. One sharp, echoing crack rang through the street, and an 84-year-old veteran crumpled onto the pavement, his fingers still wrapped around the loaf of bread he'd just paid for. The crowd outside the bar froze and watched. No one moved, no one spoke. Phones stayed tucked away, and not a single person stepped forward to help. Then, half an hour later, that heavy silence was torn apart. The air thumped with rotating blades as a Chinook helicopter dropped down onto Maple Street. Tactical soldiers poured out, fast and focused, like a storm making landfall. Because that man on the ground wasn't just some random old stranger. He was someone's father. And somewhere nearby, someone's unit had been paying attention. If you believe respect and dignity don't disappear with age, hit like, type respect in the comments, and subscribe, because this story is proof that some uniforms are never truly taken off. Most people walked past John Miller without ever really seeing him. To them, he was just another elderly man in scuffed boots, slowly passing the same bar he'd walked by every Thursday for the last over a decade years. He was 84 years old, a retired Army mechanic with 3 deployments behind him, 2 commendations to his name, and a body that no longer cooperated the way it once did. He never complained. He never asked for recognition or sympathy. All he wanted was a quiet booth at the diner, a cup of hot coffee, and enough time to make it home, leaning on his cane, one careful step at a time. That morning carried a sharper chill than usual. John pulled on his old olive-green jacket, an Army-issue coat from 1975, worn thin at the seams and patched at the sleeves, yet still holding in warmth. On the left side of his chest, you could just make out the ghost of a name tag that once clearly read J.C. Miller. He stepped out of the neighborhood convenience store with a small paper bag tucked under his arm. Inside were a loaf of bread, some cough drops, and a postcard he planned to mail to his grandson at the academy. Across the street, a group of bikers clustered outside a bar, laughing loudly, shouting over one another, and leaning against chrome-heavy motorcycles polished to a mirror shine, like trophies on display. John didn't give them a second thought. Loud noises didn't unsettle him. He'd lived through places where the absence of sound was far more frightening than chaos. As he walked past the row of bikes, the edge of his coat brushed a handlebar, just enough to make contact. The motorcycle swayed slightly but stayed upright. John stopped at once. He turned back, raised his hands, and spoke gently. "Didn't mean to touch it, son. Guess my jacket's thicker than I thought," he said, offering a small, apologetic smile. There was no sarcasm in his voice, no carelessness in his posture. He was simply an old man trying to be polite. Then the tallest biker stepped forward, sunglasses catching the midday light. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't check his bike. Without a word, he struck John across the face. The crack of the blow bounced off the brick walls. John fell to the sidewalk with a quiet grunt, one hand still gripping the paper bag as it ripped open, the bread tumbling out and rolling into the gutter. The laughter spilling out of the bar never even paused. No one rushed over. No one said a word. Someone casually lifted a glass, took a sip, and turned their chair away like nothing had happened. John didn't shout or make a scene. He slowly pushed himself upright, one knee shaking beneath him. His face flushed more from embarrassment than from the sting of the blow, and began gathering the pieces of bread scattered across the pavement. His cheek throbbed, but he didn't touch it. Instead, he reached for the crushed loaf, now streaked with dust and flecks of motor oil, and carefully placed it back into the ripped paper bag, as if it still deserved care, as if it still mattered. Around him, life kept moving. People walked past. A couple crossed the street to avoid meeting his eyes. A waitress glanced out through the diner window, hesitated, then turned back to her table. The biker who'd hit him was already joking and laughing again with his friends. There was no apology, no hesitation, just the confidence that no one would step in for a quiet old man wearing a worn-out jacket. John rose to his feet slowly, steadying himself against the metal pole beside the bus bench. His cane had rolled a few feet away. He shuffled over to retrieve it, bending down with a soft groan and a sharp wince. Not so much from the pain, but from the heavy realization of being seen and still ignored. He lowered himself onto the bench and let out a shaky breath, the cold air burning deep in his chest. His hearing aid gave off a faint buzz, but the ache in his pride was louder. Back in 1969, he'd dragged 3 soldiers out of a burning jeep just outside a small town. By 2026, he couldn't even get a passerby to offer him a paper towel to dab the blood collecting at the corner of his mouth. A teenager strolled past with earbuds in. John lifted his hand just a little, but the boy never noticed, or chose not to. John wasn't searching for pity. What he wanted was simple confirmation that he still mattered, that he was still seen. Inside the bar, the biker had already lit a cigarette, laughing and boasting to his friends. "Should have watched where he was going," he said. "Hell, the grandpa walked right into it." John felt his jaw tighten. Over a lifetime he'd been called many things: soldier, husband, father, sergeant, but worthless had never been one of them. Even so, he stayed silent. He straightened his jacket, wiped the blood from his lip with the edge of his sleeve, and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a cell phone, basic, worn, more buttons than screen, the glass cracked from years of use. On it was a single contact: Alpha 9, emergency only. John pressed it once, then leaned back against the bench and waited. 15 minutes passed. He didn't move. He didn't look furious or afraid. He simply sat there, calm and upright like someone waiting for a bus that only he knew was scheduled to arrive. Then it started, a low, distant thrum. At first, it was nothing more than a faint vibration beneath the pavement. A few people in the diner glanced around. Someone stepped out of the bar, shading their eyes as they squinted toward the horizon. The noise grew heavier, settling into a deep, steady rhythm that made the glasses on nearby tables rattle ever so slightly. The bartender stepped outside, listening carefully, his brow furrowing. "That's not a truck," he muttered, and he was right. It wasn't. From beyond the tree line, cutting through the sky like thunder-given form, the unmistakable shape of a Chinook helicopter appeared. It flew low and fast, locked on a direct path toward downtown. Phones came up instantly. Shoppers stopped mid-step. Dogs barked from inside passing cars. In less than a minute, the Chinook dropped into the open field behind the row of shops, kicking up dust as it descended. Almost immediately, a matte black SUV roared in from the opposite direction and skidded to a stop outside the bar. The doors opened at the same time. Heavy boots hit the pavement in sync. No one shouted. No one rushed. A dozen figures in tactical gear stepped out, scanning the area with sharp, practiced movements. Men who'd done this countless times and never made mistakes. From the helicopter, one man emerged and moved forward. No sunglasses, no bravado, just authority written into the way he carried himself. He was younger than John, but not by much, early 50s maybe. Broad shoulders, a firm jaw, eyes hard as steel. He walked straight to the bench. John looked up, blinked once, and gave a small nod. The man didn't salute. Instead, he dropped to one knee. "Dad," he said softly, reaching out to brush the dried blood from John's cheek. "I got here as fast as I could." John didn't respond. He didn't have to. Because in that instant, the biker, still lingering near his friends, still wearing that smug, careless grin, slowly turned toward the sudden hush that had fallen over the street. His eyes tracked the men in tactical gear, then locked onto the patch on the lead man's shoulder, U.S. Army Special Operations. That was the moment it landed. Commander Miller. And just like that, the biker understood he hadn't struck just anyone. He had struck the wrong man. The street went completely still. The biker froze in place, his leather vest creaking faintly as his shoulders tensed. The grin drained from his face, disappearing as fast as steam rising off hot asphalt. Commander Miller rose from his kneel with deliberate calm, his hands relaxed at his sides. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't ball his fists. He simply looked. Behind him, his men moved without a word, spreading out into a clean semicircle that sealed off the entire block. No guns were raised, no threats were spoken, yet their presence alone was enough to straighten spines on instinct. John remained seated. He dipped his head for a brief moment, not in surrender, but in quiet recognition. Inside the bar, the music cut out mid-note. Someone cautiously peeked through the blinds. A waitress instinctively crouched behind the counter, her phone slipping forgotten from her hand. As Commander Miller stepped forward, the biker stumbled back a half step. The commander's voice was low, controlled, and unmistakably clear. "Which one of you struck a veteran?" No one answered. Not at first. The biker stepped forward, hesitating just slightly, arms lifted in a half-hearted shield. "It's just an old man," he said, trying to sound casual. "He barely touched my bike." Miller didn't flinch, not a twitch, not a word wasted. "That man served this country while you were still figuring out how to spell your own name," he said, calm, precise. A murmur ran through the crowd. One person recording whispered, "Oh, wow." The biker let out a sharp laugh, more nervous than confident. "You military types think you can just march in like you own the street." Miller moved one deliberate step forward. Only one. Yet that single step erased the space between patience and consequence. "I didn't come here to intimidate anyone," Miller said, voice steady, quiet, almost surgical in its power. "I came because my father bled on a sidewalk while everyone else laughed." He turned, pointing a single finger at one of his men. The soldier acknowledged it, stepping aside and speaking into the radio clipped to his vest. Within 2 minutes, a police cruiser arrived, lights off, sirens silent, authority without spectacle. These officers didn't seem bored or distracted. They were alert, cautious. Miller said nothing, simply pointed at the biker. That was enough. The handcuffs clicked shut. Not with anger, not with force, just resolution. The biker offered no resistance. He didn't have it in him. The instant the cuffs locked, the swagger drained from him, leaving only the hollow weight of his mistake. Confidence dissolved like ink in rain. Almost instantly, a line of veterans formed along the sidewalk, shoulder to shoulder, quiet and steady. Miller stepped back and let them take the lead. His team stayed in place, still and watchful, as if they knew this moment wasn't theirs to claim. It belonged to a man who had never asked for recognition, and yet, for the first time, it was being given publicly. John shifted slightly on the bench, not with pride, but with a deep sense of relief. Years of quiet burden seemed to lift from his chest. This moment had grown beyond a single slap. It carried every time he had been dismissed, underestimated, ignored, and now, finally, seen. By that evening, the video had gone viral. The strike, the silence, the Chinook, the arrest. No music, no edits. Just unvarnished footage that needed no dramatization. Respect the elder, John Miller, quiet strength. Within hours, local news stations picked up the story. By morning, it was national. And they didn't just cover the incident, they told his story. Sergeant John Miller, Army mechanic, Vietnam, mission in Lebanon, 3 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, and, until yesterday, practically invisible. The bar released a careful, tepid statement, an unfortunate incident, not reflective of our values, but the public remembered what really mattered. The laughter, the turned backs, the closed doors, they weren't about to let it go unnoticed. The mayor called John's son directly, asking if the city could honor his father with a community event. Miller replied simply, "If it's for him, not for the press, he'll come." Within a week, the town green had been transformed. A stage stood at the center, rows of folding chairs lined up neatly, and the middle school chorus rehearsed the national anthem, voices carrying across the lawn. John arrived in a wheelchair, not because he needed it, but because someone had finally offered to push him, and for once he accepted the help. When he rolled forward, the crowd stood as one, not out of obligation, but from something deeper, a recognition that dignity, once restored, radiates and spreads. The mayor delivered a prepared speech, but what lingered in people's minds was the voice of John's son. Commander Miller stepped to the microphone, pausing for a long beat. "My father didn't raise his voice. He never fought back. He didn't have to. His life spoke louder than anything fists ever could." He turned toward his father, eyes glistening. "You taught me what strength really looks like, and now the world knows it too." He stepped away from the mic. John said nothing, but he lifted a single hand in acknowledgement, steady, deliberate, and firm. The ovation rolled through the crowd for nearly 4 minutes, not for medals, not for vengeance, but for every quiet act of service, every moment of sacrifice that had gone unnoticed, until now. A few days later, John found a letter waiting for him, paper thin, edges frayed, handwriting shaky and uneven, no return address. Inside, 6 words sprawled across the page. "If you'll meet me, I'll listen." The sender? The biker himself. John didn't respond at first. He could have ignored it entirely. No one would have blamed him. But there was something about the irregular lines, the ink smudged along the edges, that reminded him of a different man he had known long ago. Someone broken, angry, haunted, but not beyond reach. Someone he had once helped put back together. He asked his son to set up a private meeting before the biker's court date. In a small, quiet courthouse room, no cameras, no uniforms, the man who had struck him waited, hunched, stripped of bravado. Leather vest gone, replaced by a plain button-up. Hands tight at his sides, body tense like he was bracing for another hit. John entered slowly, letting the silence settle around him. He said nothing, just sat, radiating that veteran stillness capable of quieting any room. "I didn't know who you were," the biker admitted, voice low, almost trembling. "That's the problem," John said, calm, soft. "You didn't care enough to find out." The man swallowed hard, eyes darting. "My dad. He was a soldier too. Vietnam left him broken. I grew up hating uniforms because I thought they took him from me." John nodded slowly, letting the words hang. "I knew men like him. They lost just as much as they carried home." There was no sermon, no punishment, just a quiet room where honesty finally outshone pride. The biker, his name was Tyler, rubbed at his face, hands rough, then slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "Judge's orders aside, I'm starting therapy. I signed up to volunteer at the VA downtown. I want to make amends." John studied the paper, then looked up at the man who had once knocked him to the pavement. Slowly, deliberately, he placed one weathered hand over Tyler's. "You won't earn it all at once," he said, "but every day you show up, you'll get closer." Tyler swallowed, blinking back tears. That moment would never make headlines, but in that quiet room, 2 lives shifted. Half a year later, the corner of Liberty Avenue and Jefferson Street felt different. Where once there had been nothing, a bronze plaque now shone on a polished stone wall. It read, "In honor of Sergeant John Miller, a quiet shield between us and chaos." Beneath it, a single line etched deeper than the rest. He never asked to be seen. He simply stood. People paused now as they walked by. Not every passerby, not every time, but enough to notice. Students brought flowers on Veterans Day. A local artist painted John's silhouette into a mural celebrating community heroes. And the city council voted unanimously to rename the small park behind the bar Miller Field. John's Thursday routine hadn't changed, at least on the surface. Same scuffed boots, same faded jacket, same steady, careful gait. But now the world around him had shifted. A kid on a skateboard gave a respectful nod as he passed. A new recruit from town stopped, shook his hand, lingered just a second longer than necessary. A father pointed him out to his child, not as a story to tell, but as someone to notice. Tyler, the man who had once sent him sprawling, now spent his mornings and afternoons driving veterans to the VA. No uniform, no medals, just quiet deeds that carried the weight of a life trying to make amends. Sometimes John would see him at the diner, helping a frail old vet into a booth, lifting groceries for someone struggling. No applause, no cameras, just the soft acknowledgement of effort, a subtle nod passed between men who had learned the meaning of service in different ways. Commander Miller returned only once after the ceremony. He settled onto the same bench beside John, and silence fell comfortably between them. Words weren't required. Finally, after a pause that stretched long enough to hold the weight of memory, his son said, "You taught them something, Dad. You changed this place." John gave a faint smile, eyes following a boy who carefully tied a small flag to his bicycle. "Maybe," he said softly, "or maybe they just remembered what matters." That night, the wind swept through the trees near the bar, carrying with it the faint echo of rotors. Not in the sky, but in memory. And if you stood still long enough, you could almost hear it. The moment a whole town held its breath because one man refused to fall alone. If you believe respect shouldn't arrive only after pain, if you believe some uniforms are never truly shed,